Our journey today begins in the year 451, on a vast open plain in northeastern Gaul. Here, beneath a wide and restless sky, two enormous armies stand facing one another. To the east stretches a host unlike anything the Roman world has seen for generations. Thousands of horsemen drawn from across the steppe, Huns at the centre, surrounded by warriors of many nations, Ostrogoths, Gepids, Alans, and countless others whose fortunes now follow a single man. At their head rides Attila. For years his armies have thundered across Europe. Cities along the Danube have fallen before him. Emperors have been forced to buy peace with mountains of gold. Armies sent against him have broken and scattered. Across the Roman world his name has become something more than that of a king. To many he is simply the scourge of God. And now the storm he commands has ridden more than 1,000 miles westward. Its destiny lies here, on the battlefield. But waiting across the plain stands another army. Romans, Visigoths, Franks, Burgundians, former rivals now drawn together in a desperate alliance under the command of a single Roman general, Flavius Aetius. They know that if Attila breaks through them today, there will be little left in the Western world capable of stopping him. The fate of the entire Roman world hangs in the balance. And so, as the sun sinks towards the horizon, the two greatest forces of their age prepare to collide. Soon the plains of Gaul will shake beneath the thunder of 1,000 hooves, and before the day is over, the fate of the Roman West will be decided. But to understand how the world came to this moment, how a rider from the distant grasslands rose to challenge an empire, we must go back beyond Gaul, back beyond the Danube, back to the great steppe, where the storm first began to gather. To understand the fear that would one day grip the Roman world, we must begin far to the north of the empire, beyond the Danube frontier. Here, across the vast grasslands of the Eurasian steppe, live the Huns, a powerful confederation of nomadic people whose way of life differed sharply from that of the settled Roman world. Their wealth was measured not in cities or farmland, but in horses, weapons, and followers. Authority rested with those who could command loyalty in war and lead warriors successfully across great distances. By the early 5th century, the Huns had already established themselves as a formidable force along Rome's northern borders. Their armies moved with a speed unfamiliar to Roman commanders, and their tactics, which centered on mounted archers, were extremely difficult to confront in the open field. For the Roman Empire, the Huns were a problem that could not easily be contained. Let us fast forward now to the year 434. The Hunnic leader Rua has died, and power has passed to his two nephews, Bleda and Attila. The brothers rule together in joint kingship, inheriting their uncle's powerful network of warriors and allied tribes. To Roman observers, the idea of two rulers might have seemed strange, but on the steppe this arrangement was entirely natural. The Hunnic world was not, after all, a tightly controlled state, but was a coalition of powerful leaders and their followers. Leadership could be shared so long as both rulers commanded equal respect, and this was possible as the brothers led their own forces and coordinated their campaigns against Rome. Their first confrontation with the empire came soon after they assumed power, as, in 435, Roman envoys would travel north to negotiate what would become known as the Treaty of Margus. Here the Romans agreed to return Hunnic fugitives, restrict trade along the frontier, and, most significantly, double the annual tribute they paid in gold, increasing it from 350 to 700 pounds weight each year, in order to secure peace. It was a settlement bought with coin and reluctant respect. But it would not satisfy the ambitions of the two young rulers. Indeed, within only a few years, the brothers launched new campaigns along the Danube frontier. Roman territory was devastated. Cities such as Viminacium, Singidunum, and Naissus fell in rapid succession. Roman defences struggled to respond to an enemy that seemed to live in the saddle. warriors who could appear suddenly, strike with terrifying precision, and vanish before a conventional army could bring them to battle. Faced with this mounting pressure, Roman authorities had little choice but to increase the payments of gold still further in order to buy peace once again. And peace was becoming expensive. For the Huns, the rewards of war were becoming increasingly difficult to resist. By the mid-5th century, the two brothers stood at the head of the most formidable cavalry power the Roman world had faced in generations. They had forced half of the Roman Empire to purchase peace with enormous sums of gold. Their influence stretched across the plains north of the Danube, and their armies had already shaken the Eastern Empire to its very core. Across the frontier, the mere mention of their names began to inspire fear. They were becoming something new in the politics of the late Roman world. A rising superpower, on horseback. Yet, as their reputation spread, an event occurred that would change the course of history. Bleda died, leaving Attila to rule, alone. But instead of weakening the storm gathering on the steppe, it unleashed it. Around the year 445, the partnership that had led the Hunnic world for more than a decade came to an abrupt end. Bleda was dead. The circumstances behind its death have been lost to time. Later Roman writers claim that Attila himself had killed his brother, and, although this is a possibility, it should be remembered that these authors were enemies of the Huns and wrote long after the events they described. The Huns themselves left no written record, and so the exact truth of what happened between the brothers may never be known. What is certain, however, is this. From that moment forward, Attila stood alone at the head of the Hunnic armies, and, as sole ruler, he began the transformation that would make him one of the most feared war leaders the Roman world had ever faced. The evidence of this soon appeared across the Roman frontier. In the late 440s, Attila launched a new wave of campaigns against the Eastern Roman Empire. His armies crossed the Danube and drove deep into the Balkan provinces, striking with the terrifying speed that had already become the hallmark of Hunnic warfare. Cities such as Marcianopol, Philippopolis, and Arcadiopolis fell as the Hunnic cavalry swept south. Roman garrisons attempted to resist, but they struggled to counter the most feared weapon of the age, Attila's mounted warriors. These were men who could strike at speed, disappear before Roman forces could organize a response, and then return again from another direction, looking for weak points. Roman sources describe fortresses destroyed, and as news of Attila's victory spread, towns were abandoned and entire regions emptied as his armies advanced. The devastation placed enormous pressure on the government in Constantinople, and once again the Eastern Roman Empire had little choice but to negotiate. But this time the terms imposed by Attila revealed just how powerful he had become. Under the settlement that followed, often known as the Treaty of Anatolius, the Romans agreed to pay an extraordinary £2,100 weight of gold each year in tribute, along with a massive one-time payment of £6,000 of gold. As Attila's victories mounted, his reputation spread across the Roman world. Imperial officials wrote of him with growing alarm. Envoys were sent north across the frontier to negotiate directly with the king of the Huns. One of these envoys was the historian Priscus, whose account provides the most remarkable surviving description of Attila himself. Priscus expected to encounter a barbarian ruler displaying the spoils of conquest, and instead what he saw surprised him deeply. At Attila's court, the nobles of the Hunnic Confederation did feast from elaborate vessels of gold and silver, yet Priscus tells us Attila himself sat amongst them using only simple wooden cups and plates. His clothing was plain, his manner restrained. Where others displayed their riches openly, Attila appeared austere. To Priscus, the message was unmistakable. This was not a man interested in the comforts of victory. This was a warlord. Victory alone was what mattered to him. Any peace he accepted would therefore only ever be temporary, for this was a man who lived to ride his army to battle for the pursuit of conquest. And so, by the late 440s, the king of the Huns had become the most formidable war leader beyond the Roman frontier. His armies had devastated the eastern provinces. His demands had forced emperors into humiliating agreements, and his authority stretched across a vast confederation of tribes and warriors, gathered beneath his command. To his followers, he was the supreme leader of the steppe. To his enemies, he'd become something far more ominous, the scourge of God. But even this was not enough for Attila. By the year 451, unsatisfied with the fear and wealth he had already won, the king of the Huns prepared for the greatest campaign of his life. He would go west, and soon the thunder of Hunnic hooves would roll across Europe. In the spring of 451, the storm that had been gathering across the steppe finally broke. Attila began to move. From the plains beyond the Danube, the Hunnic armies surged westward. Across rivers and plains, through forests and frontier lands, the army advanced with astonishing speed. The distance from the Danube to the cities of Gaul was more than 1,000 miles of road and wilderness, yet the Hunnic host crossed that distance like a storm sweeping across open ground. Where it travelled, fear travelled faster still. Rumours raced ahead of the army. The Huns were coming. Cities closed their gates, villages emptied. Refugees filled the roads of Gaul, fleeing westward from an enemy they had never seen, but one that terrified them. Then the army arrived. In April 451, Attila's forces descended upon the city of Metz. The chronicles record that the city fell on Easter Day. Its walls were breached, its streets filled with fire, and the news of the destruction spread across Gaul like wildfire. If Metz could fall so quickly, many believed nothing could stop the advance. And they had good reason to worry, as this was no mere raid across the frontier looking for tribute. This was a campaign on a scale the Western Empire had not faced in centuries. From the Hungarian plains to the heart of Gaul, the king of the Huns had carried the full weight of his confederation westward, and with every mile the army advanced, the danger grew. If Attila succeeded here, the balance of power in the Western world might collapse entirely. And yet, the Roman world had not completely forgotten how to resist. There remained one commander who understood the threat better than most: Flavius Aetius. Aetius had spent part of his youth among the peoples of the steppe as a hostage, learning firsthand how they fought and how they thought. He knew what Attila's army was capable of, and he understood something that many others did not: that Rome could not defeat Attila alone. He knew if the Hunnic advance was to be stopped, it would require something rare in the fractured politics of the Western Empire: unity. Aetius began to gather allies, joining with warriors of other kingdoms, Visigoths, Burgundians, and Franks, former rivals, old enemies, but now drawn together by a single fear. Across Gaul, the great forces of the age began to converge. From the east came Attila, and the thunder of his cavalry. From the west came Aetius, assembling a coalition he hoped was strong enough to face the storm. And so, on the Catalonian plains, the thunder of hooves would meet its first true resistance, and the fate of the Roman West would hang in the balance. In the summer of 451, the armies of the Roman world and the Hunnic Confederation met on the wide open plains of northeastern Gaul. For Attila, the long ride west had brought him to the greatest test of his career. And for Rome and its allies, this was the final attempt to halt the storm that had been gathering for decades, and to save Western Europe. Across the battlefield, the two armies stretched for miles. At the centre of the eastern host rode Attila's cavalry, the mounted archers whose speed had terrorized the Roman frontier for years. Opposing them stood the great coalition, assembled by the Roman general Flavius Aetius. And between the two armies lay a shallow ridge rising gently above the plain. Both commanders understood immediately that whoever controlled the high ground would hold the advantage when the battle began. And so, the moment the lines began to move, both sides surged towards it. The plain erupted in motion, cavalry thundered forward, infantry pushed hard towards the rising ground. The struggle for the high ground was fierce, but it was the Roman coalition that arrived first. Visigoth warriors surged up the slope and formed their line along the crest, and when Attila's riders reached the hill, they found that the position was already held. For the first time in years, the Hunnic king faced an enemy that was ready for him. Then Attila unleashed the storm. Across the plain, the Hunnic cavalry surged forward in wave after wave. Mounted archers galloped across the battlefield, loosing arrows as they rode. They struck the Roman line, wheeled away before a counterattack could reach them, and then returned again from another direction. Arrows darkened the sky. The coalition line bent beneath the pressure, but it did not break. Now the battle spread across the entire field. Steel met steel. War cries echoed across the plain. And, as the struggle intensified, the Visigoths launched a charge of their own. Their king Theodoric led them forward into the fighting. Visigoth warriors slammed into the Hunnic flank in brutal close combat. The clash was savage. Shields shattered. Men were driven to the ground beneath the weight of horses and armour. Somewhere in the chaos, King Theodoric fell. Ancient sources tell us that he was either struck down in the fighting or trampled beneath the press of men and horses. For a moment, the Visigoth line wavered. But then his son, Thorismund, seized the moment. He rallied the warriors around him and drove them forward again. The charge resumed with renewed fury. Now, the momentum of the battle began to shift. The Hunnic lines began to give ground. Slowly, step by step, Attila's forces were pushed back across the field, and at last the Hunnic king retreated towards the defensive ring of wagons that were the centre of his camp. Inside the wagon circle, the Hunnic king prepared for the possibility of a final stand. Some ancient writers claim that Attila even ordered a great funeral pyre to be prepared, a final blaze in which he would throw himself rather than to fall into enemy hands. But the last assault never came. Night was falling, the Visigoths were now without their king, and the Roman commander Aetius faced a difficult calculation. If Attila were completely destroyed, the Visigoths, who were now the strongest force in the region, might emerge too powerful for Rome itself to control. So instead of pressing the attack, the coalition held its ground. When dawn came, Attila made his decision: to escape. The Hunnic king broke camp. His army withdrew eastward, back towards the lands beyond the Rye. He had not been destroyed, but for the first time in years, the advance of Attila the Hun had been stopped. The plains of Gaul had held, and, although the storm had not been broken, the danger it posed to the west had passed. Although the Battle of the Catalonian Plains halted Attila's advance into Gaul, it did not completely destroy his power. The following year, in 452, the king of the Huns launched a new campaign, this time into the Italian peninsula. Crossing the Alps, his armies descended upon the cities of northern Italy. The powerful fortress city of Aquileia was eventually taken and destroyed after a difficult siege, and other towns across the northern plain were abandoned as the Hunnic army advanced southward. For a moment, it seemed like the storm had returned. Yet the campaign did not last. Operating far from his base of power and facing growing problems of supply, Attila eventually withdrew from Italy and returned homeward towards the lands beyond the Danube. And then, quite suddenly, the storm ended. In the year 453, Attila died. Ancient writers record that the great warlord died on the night of his wedding to a young bride named Ildiko. According to one account, he suffered a sudden hemorrhage while sleeping and choked on his own blood during the night. However, since this story was written down more than a century after Attila's death, the exact cause of the warlord's final hours must remain uncertain. His death brought a rapid end to the unity he had imposed upon the many peoples of the Hunnic Confederation. Within only a few years, the empire he had forged through war and personal authority began to fracture as rival leaders struggled for power. Within a generation, the power of the Huns had faded from Europe altogether. Yet Attila's reputation endured. To Roman writers, he remained the terrifying conqueror who had shaken the empire to its very core. Attila lived his life much like the charger he rode into battle, relentless, powerful, and always at full pace. Many mysteries still surround both his life and his death. But for a short time in history, he was the greatest warlord of his age, and perhaps the greatest threat the Roman world had ever faced. The storm he unleashed eventually passed, Yet the thunder of those hooves still echo faintly through the centuries, even if only as a whisper in time.